So what I'm going to do now with this lecturette is I'm going to look at the skeleton of the bird and also look at structures of flight, not just of the skeleton, but of other things as well. Okay, so let's start out with the skull. We can see here that we have a premaxilla. Okay, so this is the bone that is under the beak. Yeah, there is bone in a beak. And we find that depending on the diet of the animal, this beak is going to have varying morphology. Okay, so we can look at the chicken versus the eagle versus the duck versus the woodpecker versus the parrot. There's some variation. Okay. Within this, we have a very large opening, the nasal aperture. Okay, so this is how the air gets into the nasal cavity. Down here we have a mandible. Okay, I'm not going to go through and label all of these bones, but I do want to point out here we have a very nice zygomatic arch. We're also going to have a frontal bone, a parietal bone, and a temporal bone. Okay, we see here a very large space. Here, this is the orbit. This is where the eye is going to sit. And if we've got an eye, we're going to have an optic nerve. And that optic nerve is going to have to go through something to get to the brain. And so therefore, we're going to have an optic foramen. Okay, we look over at this other image. In another lecturette, I'll go over more detail of the head. But I just wanted to point out the choanal cleft. So in the mammal, we saw that the choanae was the passage from the nasal cavity into the nasopharynx. Okay. In birds, we don't have a soft palate, so we're not going to have a nasopharynx. Okay. So the choanal cleft is that opening between the nasal cavity and the oral cavity. Likewise, recall that in that nasopharynx was the opening into the auditory tubes that go to the middle ear. Well, since we don't have a nasopharynx, we have the infundibular cleft, which is basically the passageway that communicates between the oral cavity and the auditory tubes. Okay? So here, once again, we have the skull. And we look here at the cervical vertebra. Recall in the mammal, generally we have 7 cervical vertebrae. Okay, we do have some variation among the sloths and even the manatee, but in general we have 7. Here in the bird we have quite a bit of variation among our bird species, with those with shorter necks having only about 8 or so, while those such as the swan that have very long necks may have as many as 25 cervical vertebrae. Okay? In chickens, there's generally only about 14 to 17. We notice that flyers tend to have a very short, stiff trunk. Okay, fusion of adjacent vertebrae is common in birds, and even in the absence of that fusion, the joints between the trunk and the vertebra are relatively limited in the motion. Okay. We look over here at this image down here, we see that the ribs tend to be flat and broad, and they have a little structure here called the uncinate process, which is thought maybe to provide bracing between the different ribs. Okay. Generally, the thoracic vertebrae number from 3 to 10. Chickens have about 7, with ribs that fuse to the sternum. We find that the first 3 to 5 thoracic vertebrae may be fused, followed by a single free thoracic vertebra that remains unfused. That portion that's fused is known as the notarium. Okay, we look back here at the pelvis, and we see there's an ilium and an ischium. We don't have a pubic bone here. But then we have a fusion of the last thoracic vertebra, as well as the lumbar vertebra, the sacrum, and the first few caudal vertebrae. And this forms a structure that we know as the synsacrum. So we see here that the pectoral girdle is very large and strong and firmly attached to the body, and it's virtually immovable. Okay. We see that the tailbones are also quite compact, and this forms what we know as the pygostyle. Okay. This is going to support the tail feathers. We see also that the vertebrae are fused, and so that we have just one sternum or keel. So let's now look at the thoracic girdle. We see that, once again, the keel here allows for attachment of the larger pectoralis muscles, which are required for flight. We see a bone here called the coracoid. Okay, these kind of act like a strut, limiting the movement of the shoulder towards the keel from pull of the pectoralis muscles during the downstroke and from the pull of the supracoracoid muscles during the upstroke. The clavicles are fused to form what we know as the furcula. You may also know this as the wishbone. Okay, this is thought to be important for maintaining a set distance between the shoulders. It has been observed by Goslow et al. In an American Zoology article that the dorsal portion of this Y shifts laterally during the downstroke and then moves medially by just elastic recoil during the upstroke. The furcula may also, coupled with the movement of the sternebrae during flight, play a role in the cycling of air between the air sacs and the lungs. We see that the scapula is very much reduced, but it's still very much important in maintaining the positioning and stabilization of the shoulder while in flight. Okay, then we look at the humerus here. Ah. Then we have the ulna, which you notice is the thicker of the two bones of the radius and ulna, which is different from what we see in mammals. Usually the ulna is the thinner and the radius is the thicker of the two. We then have the radial and ulnar carpal bones and a structure known as the carpal metacarpus, where we have fusion of those last carpal bones with the metacarpal bones. And then we have the digits. Okay, so we have in the wing we have digits 1, 2, and 3. So one of the requirements of flight, flyers need to be very lightweight. Okay, so we find that birds have lighter skeleton relative to non-flyers of comparable size. So in man, we have about 12 to 15% of our body weight is made up of our skeleton, whereas that of the eagle is only about 7% of the total body weight. We see many of the bones are hollow and air-filled. They're pneumatized. Okay, this allows the bones to have a maximum diameter and therefore a maximum resistance to bending while having a minimum weight. Many of the bones have a thinner inner and outer lamellae, which are joined by spicules that run along stress lines. So we can see here these little spicules here that are running along stress lines, and this is going to provide maximum strength with minimum heavy hard tissue. Okay, we also see that there is a reduction and a loss of digits, which is going to save weight, as well as a loss of teeth. Looking here once again at the wing, we see that similar to the limbs in runners, the joints in the wings in both birds as well as bats are constructed to limit the movement of the limb to primarily one plane. This is going to reduce unnecessary movement. Okay, we see here that the ulna is going to adhere to the radius in birds at the elbow and at the carpus to form a parallelogram. Okay, very similar to the reciprocal apparatus in the horse. Therefore, when the elbow extends, so does the wrist, and likewise with flexion. This is going to reduce the need of muscles to perform these actions. So speaking of muscles, so let's have a look at the muscles of flight. Before we do that though, let's identify some of these bones over here. Here we can see the keel of the sternum peeking out. We see the furcula here, the wishbone. And we also see the coracoid bone. Okay, we're going to come back to these in a bit. So flapping flight is just fascinating, but not completely understood. How the movement of the wing generates the movement of the air over the wing to produce sufficient lift and propulsion is just amazing. Okay, so we've got muscles that are going to be important for depression of the wing as well as elevation. The pectoralis muscles are the primary depressors of the wing. So as they contract, they're going to bring the wing downward. Pectoralis muscles are also contribute to pronation nearing the end of that downstroke, providing additional thrust. They also contribute to retraction of the wing for proper orientation during takeoff and landing. Okay, I told you we'd come back to these bones. The coracoid, the furcula, and the scapula create what is known as the triosseous canal. Okay, the name says it all. Triosseous. 3 bones are making up this canal. And what is passing through this canal is the supracoracoideus muscle. Okay, so this is that muscle, that thin muscle that lies deep to the pectoralis muscle. You may have noticed sometime when you're eating chicken breast. Okay, so this thinner muscle lies under it. It's going to pass through this triosseous canal to attach to the dorsal surface near the head of the humerus. Okay, so this is going to be our muscle for elevation of the wing. The supracoracoideus also is important to impart a high velocity longitudinal rotation of the humerus to reorient the wing at the end of the upstroke in preparation for the downstroke. Okay, so we've got kind of overlap of the action of these muscles both at the end of the upstroke and at the end of the downstroke. A study by Boehner found that the other extrinsic and intrinsic muscles, by adjusting the orientation and shape of the wing, can alter the wing's aerodynamics for maneuverability. Okay. He also found something interesting in that shifts in the body, tail, and wing during takeoff or level or landing flight may be achieved by changes in whole body pitch rather than by changes in the wing or tail motion relative to the body itself. So this makes it a little more questionable. What do these other intrinsic, extrinsic muscles of the wing do? Okay, so there's a lot more study to be done, but the problem is putting electrodes or other instrumentation on those muscles of the wing is really hard without altering the ability to fly in a wind tunnel. Okay, here's a gross image just to show a little better those muscles we spoke of. There's the keel of the sternum. Just a note, the keel of the sternum may be also used for bone marrow sampling. Okay, but here we can see that supracoracoid muscle deep to the pectoralis muscle. Okay, so next time you're eating chicken, you can identify those. Okay, now notice in birds the concentration of flight muscles are positioned on the breast so their weight is near or just below the support of the body by the wings. Okay, this is important for their flight. So I put this image up here just to remind me to tell you that the tail feathers are used in steering and braking during flight. Okay, so I only had one feather picture to share with you. Here we have a contour feather. The feather is made up of a main shaft. That main shaft is continuous with the quill on the proximal end. That quill is actually hollow. except for at the very end where it contains the dermal papilla. So the dermal papilla, just like that in the hair, is going to provide nutrition and stuff to the cells responsible for the production and maintenance of the feather. Coming off that main shaft on either side, we have what are referred to as the veins. And these veins are made up of barbs. We find that on these barbs, over on this image at the right, if we separate them, we see these very fine barbules. Okay, that's what helps hold those barbs together. They're kind of a Velcro type thing that holds them together. Okay, let's have a look at an illustration of the wing here. Now notice here, up at the first digit, we have a little structure known as the alula. So the alula has been long thought to enhance lift and delay stalling. Okay, Alvarez et al. Found that the alula is a high lift device. Okay, so you see here it's located at the leading edge of the wing, and it's going to allow these animals to fly at larger angles of attack and lower speeds without the wing stalling. Okay, similarly, in some extent, it works as those leading edge slats in aircraft wings, okay, which are only operating during takeoff and landing. We see here that the primary feathers are going to attach along the carpus, metacarpus, and the digits, whereas the secondary feathers are going to attach along the ulna. Okay, we see a feathered membrane attaching from the shoulder out to the digits, and a portion of this, known as the postpatagium, is going to be between the elbow and the digits. And then there's going to be a propatagium, which is going to extend from the shoulder out to the carpus. Now that propatagium is important because it's going to create an airfoil. Okay, so if we do a cut through like this and show it here, we see that that protagium kind of is the front kind of a camber. Okay, so this is going to help with lift. Moving down to the hind limbs of the bird, here once again we see the ilium and the ischium. The ilium, the ischium, and the femur make up what we know as the thigh when we're eating a chicken. Yes, they do have a patella. And then we have the tibia and the smaller laterally associated fibula. Okay, these are the bones that we find in the drumstick. And then distally, once again, the tarsal bones are going to fuse with the metatarsal bones, so we have a tarsal metatarsus. And then we have another sesamoid bone, which is the hypotarsal sesamoid bone. Okay, this is going to be within the flexor tendons of the digits. And then we have the digits, and on this bird we have the first back here, the second, the third, and the fourth digit. Now, one thing that is very important, especially in birds that sit on a perch, is that the flexor tendons are going to come around back here and then to the digits like this. Okay? So when the bird lowers the body, the flexion of that tarsus is going to put tension here, which is also going to put tension down here, causing the flexion of the digits. Okay, so just by crouching down, lowering their body, they're going to passively grip the branch on which they're perched. Okay, so when they're resting, they're sleeping, it's going to be a tight grip without them having to think about flexing those muscles. So an easy way to get the bird off the perch is just to lift it up so it stretches out those limbs. Pretty cool, huh? Okay, so that is the skeleton and the structures of flight within the bird.